Hi, first grade. Ms. Vaughn here. So the last chapter was called Bad News. So that's something that's happening in the story. That would answer the question, what? What is happening? Wilbur got some bad news from who? Yes, that old sheep spreading bad news. Charlotte said she would save Wilbur. So as we listen to the next chapter, let's see if we find out how Charlotte's going to do that. We may or may not in the next chapter. But readers, think about things that are happening in the story as they're listening. So be listening for any information we can gather. Now the next chapter, chapter 8, is called A Talk at Home. So where do we think this part of the story is going to happen? Any predictions? My guess it's going to happen in Fern's home, because that's the only home we've known so far. Fern's home, Zuckerman's barn. A Talk at Home. On Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arable and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. "Did you know that Uncle Homer's goslings had hatched?" said Fern. "How many?" said Mr. Arable. "7," replied Fern. "There were 8 eggs, but 1 egg didn't hatch, and the goose told Templeton she didn't want it anymore, so he took it away. The goose did what?" said Mrs. Arable, gazing at her daughter with a queer, sort of worried look. "Show me your worried look." Yeah. "Well, she told Templeton she didn't want the egg anymore," repeated Fern. Who is Templeton?" asked Mrs. Arable. "Oh, he's the rat. None of us like him much." "Who's us?" asked Mr. Arable. "Oh, everybody in the barn cellar. Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the goslings and Charlotte and me." Charlotte? Who's Charlotte?" said Mrs. Arable. "Oh, she's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever." Huh. "What does she look like?" "Well," said Fern thoughtfully, "she has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess." "Charlotte is a spider?" Fern nodded. "A big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and she sucks their blood. Wilbur adores her." "Does he really?" said Mrs. Arable rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried expression on her face. "Oh, yes, Wilbur adores Charlotte. Do you know what Charlotte said when the goslings were born?" "I haven't the faintest idea," said Mrs. Arable. "Tell us." "Well, when the first gosling stuck its little head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner and Charlotte was on her web. She made a speech and she said, 'I am sure that every one of us here in the barn cellar will be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on the part of the goose, she has something to show for it.' Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Arable. "And now, Fern, it's time to get ready for Sunday school. And tell Avery to get ready. And this afternoon you can tell me more about what goes on in Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending quite a lot of time there? You go there almost every afternoon, don't you?" "Oh, I like it there," replied Fern. She wiped her mouth and she ran upstairs. After she left the room, Mrs. Arable spoke in a low voice to her husband. "I worry about Fern. Did you hear the way she rambled on about animals, pretending that they talk?" Mr. Arable chuckled. "Maybe they do talk. I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's just got a lively imagination. Kids think they hear all sorts of things. Just the same, I do worry about her. I think I shall ask Dr. Dorian about her the next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do, and I want him to know how queerly she is acting about that pig and everything. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well, animals don't talk." Mr. Arable grinned. "Maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's," he said. That's the end of that chapter. I love that.